One must marvel at the breathtaking moral contortions required for the sitting President of the United States to repeatedly refuse to rule out a pardon for a convicted child sex trafficker. In a world already saturated with political depravity, we have now reached that special nadir where the chief executive, when asked directly whether he might grant clemency to Ghislaine Maxwell, a woman serving 20 years for procuring children for sexual abuse, responds not with the instantaneous revulsion any decent human being would muster, but with the coy evasiveness of a man keeping his options open. The spectacle before us is nothing less than the complete moral bankruptcy of a political movement that once claimed to be waging war against elite pedophile rings. Here we have Maxwell, convicted beyond reasonable doubt of recruiting and grooming teenage girls for Jeffrey Epstein's predations, suddenly transformed into a potential recipient of presidential mercy. The same movement that spawned countless conspiracy theories about secret cabals of child abusers now finds its standard-bearer openly contemplating freedom for one of the few people actually convicted of such crimes. The irony would be delicious if it weren't so utterly revolting. Consider the sequence of events that has brought us to this grotesque juncture. First, the Trump administration, after months of promising to release the so-called Epstein files, suddenly discovers that the president's own name appears in those documents. Then, in a maneuver so transparent it insults the intelligence of earthworms, Deputy Attorney General Todd Blanche, Trump's former personal lawyer, one notes with no surprise whatsoever, conducts a private interview with Maxwell in prison. Shortly thereafter, this convicted sex trafficker is mysteriously transferred to a minimum security facility, a privilege typically denied to those guilty of sexual offenses. And then, as if following a script written by someone with contempt for both law and decency, Maxwell produces testimony declaring Trump to have been nothing but a perfect gentleman. The quid pro quo dangles before us with all the subtlety of a neon sign in a bordello. Maxwell wants out of prison. Trump wants exoneration from any association with Epstein's crimes. And so we witness this obscene dance, where a woman whom the Justice Department once called a brazen liar suddenly becomes a character witness for the president, her testimony treated as gospel by those who would dismiss sworn affidavits from multiple victims as fake news. Even more nauseating than Trump's transparent self-interest is the pathetic genuflection of Republican leadership. When asked about the possibility of pardoning a child sex trafficker, House Speaker Mike Johnson mumbles about it not being his lane before offering the weakest possible criticism, as if opposing clemency for someone who facilitated the rape of children requires careful political calculation. Senate Majority Leader John Thune performs similar gymnastics, deferring to presidential prerogative rather than stating the obvious, that pardoning Maxwell would be an abomination. This cowardice from the Republican establishment reveals something darker than mere political calculation. It exposes a party so thoroughly corrupted by its submission to Trump that it cannot even bring itself to categorically oppose freedom for a convicted child sex trafficker. These are the same people who weaponize accusations of pedophilia against their political opponents, who claim to be protecting children from drag queen story hours and transgender athletes. Yet when confronted with an actual convicted facilitator of child sexual abuse, they hedge and equivocate. The victims in this sordid affair, those women whose childhoods were stolen by Epstein and Maxwell, have been relegated to bit players in a political drama centered entirely on Trump's self-preservation. Virginia Giuffre's relatives describe Maxwell as a monster who deserves to rot in prison, yet their pleas fall on deaf ears as the machinery of power grinds toward its seemingly inevitable conclusion. Maxwell will likely receive some form of clemency in exchange for her convenient testimony. Federal Judge Paul Engelmeyer saw through this charade with crystalline clarity, writing that the administration's supposed transparency efforts were demonstrably false and appeared aimed not at disclosure but at diversion. He recognized what any observer with functioning neurons could see, that the entire performance of interviewing Maxwell and releasing selective transcripts was theater designed to create the illusion of transparency while concealing whatever truths lie buried in those files. The conservative media ecosystem, ever ready to debase itself in service of Trump, has already begun the rehabilitation of Maxwell. Laura Loomer, that paragon of investigative journalism, celebrates Maxwell's testimony as proof that Trump has always been an honorable person. One struggles to imagine a more perfect inversion of reality. a convicted child sex trafficker's word being used to establish someone's honor. It would be satirical if it weren't actually happening. Meanwhile, the same conservatives who spent years demanding the release of Epstein's client list now suddenly find themselves remarkably incurious about why their hero refuses to release the very documents he promised to make public. The cognitive dissonance required to simultaneously believe that elite pedophile rings must be exposed while supporting a president who considers pardoning a convicted member of such a ring would break the minds of anyone capable of coherent thought. What we are witnessing is nothing less than the complete moral collapse of American conservatism. A movement that wraps itself in the flag and clutches its pearls about protecting children now finds itself in the position of potentially advocating for the release of someone who spent years identifying vulnerable girls for a predator. The party of family values contemplates mercy for someone whose crimes against families and children are literally unspeakable. The fact that Maxwell's transfer to a more comfortable prison facility violated Bureau of Prisons policy, sex offenders are explicitly barred from minimum security camps, merely adds another layer to this tower of corruption. Rules, it seems, are infinitely flexible when the convicted sex trafficker in question might have useful things to say about the president. One can only imagine the reaction from these same Republicans if a Democratic president had arranged special treatment for a convicted child sex trafficker who subsequently provided convenient testimony. This entire episode strips bare the fundamental lie at the heart of Trumpism, that it represents any kind of moral framework whatsoever. When push comes to shove, when the choice is between protecting children and protecting Trump, the movement chooses Trump every time. The welfare of abuse victims, the integrity of the justice system, the basic moral principle that child sex traffickers should serve their sentences, all of this becomes negotiable when weighed against the possibility that Trump might face accountability for his associations. The most bitter irony is that Trump's base, those foot soldiers who spread QAnon conspiracies about satanic pedophile cabals, are now being asked to accept that pardoning an actual convicted child sex trafficker might be acceptable if she says nice things about their leader. The mental gymnastics required for this transformation would challenge an Olympic athlete, yet they perform them with the ease of those who have long ago surrendered any claim to intellectual or moral consistency. As this shabby drama unfolds, one thing becomes crystal clear: there is no bottom. There is no depth of degradation to which Trump will not sink, and no depth to which his enablers will not follow. The party that once claimed to stand for law and order now contemplates clemency for a woman who helped destroy the lives of countless young girls. The movement that positions itself as the defender of children's innocence now shrugs at the possibility of releasing their abuser. History will record this moment as one of complete moral abandonment, when a political party became so intoxicated by power and so enslaved to one man's ego that it could no longer muster even performative opposition to pardoning a convicted child sex trafficker. When future generations study the collapse of American political morality, they will mark this as a defining moment, when the President of the United States treated clemency for Ghislaine Maxwell as a legitimate option, and his party, to its eternal shame, refused to stop him.